Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doris Onyango. I work at Semabox. Semabox is Africa's premier podcasting studio. We are based out of Riverside Drive, just where Baraza Media Lab is. Our aim is to, take podcasting to the world. I also run a program called the Dada Podcast Incubator, where we incubate African stories created by women and non-binary individuals. So that's a little bit about myself. And if I could now start introducing the wonderful panel. So Mpindi Abbas is the CEO of the Media Challenge Initiative, MCI, a Ugandan-based organization, the next generation of journalists in Uganda. Fantastic. And then we have Purity Mukami, who is a data journalist based in Nairobi. She has worked with various international media outlets, including the UK-based Finance Uncovered, the BBC Africa Eye, and Africa Uncensored, and an investigative journalism production house in Kenya. She is also an expert on data-driven and open-source investigations and fact-checking, particularly for journalism. Karibu sana. And then we have John Allan Namu, who is an investigative journalist and CEO of Africa Uncensored, an investigative and in-depth journalism production house in Nairobi, Kenya. Africa Uncensored ambition is to be the premier source of unique, important, and incisive journalism. So everybody, can we just say hello to our panelists with just a round of applause? Okay, so today's session is tuning back in, We want to counter the cycle of toxic news through the constructive and explanatory journalism. The digital media landscape has really exploded, and that has provided, space for sensationalist and toxic news that audiences have reported that it leaves them feeling overwhelmed and disengaged. We hope to examine the role of constructive journalism in our context in shaping public discourse and restoring trust. Yeah? So I'll keep my questions to 5, and then I'll leave the rest to the panel. And I'd like to begin with ladies first. It's Valentine's Day, so we give them priority. So how can journalists produce quality, constructive, and insightful content in our fast-paced journalism and media cycle?
Okay, I didn't expect to start, but I'll take the challenge. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone listening. In terms of how journalists can produce quality news in this fast-paced environment, in my view, and let me say I'm not one of the journalists, I'm like one of the people who collaborate with journalists, but see the way he's looking at me because they decided to have one data journalist. So I'm basically a mathematician, a statistician, but I've worked with them for like 5 years now. And based on the stories that we've worked on, which I can, or some of the quality content that I see out here, I think as much as the news cycle is very fast-paced, there is need to probably invest and pay more attention to research and collaborating with expertise that is not necessarily journalism. So I would say spend some time with research or invest in a bit of research. When I say research, I'm not only talking of data. Because in my view, journalists play a huge role in how the population think based on how they deliver the news. So to go a bit deeper, to give a bit more context, to give people, why they should care and why they should consume this news. One of the things I will mention right now is collaborate with experts and invest time and money in research.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. My next question will be to you, John. Anybody who's Kenyan, your name is not a strange name. And it's important for us to know, for the journalists in the room, what are the key elements of effective, and explanatory journalism? I feel like in this space, I can probably say I haven't watched news for like 6 years, because I just said, you're just giving me sound bites, and I'd like to understand the things, and you're not giving me the explanation I want. So for the journalists, what are the key elements of like explanatory journalism, and how can journalists apply those elements?
Okay, thank you, and thank you to everybody who's in the room. The key elements. Okay, so I'll take a crack at it from our experience, right? So anything that has ever worked for Africa Uncensored in terms of impact and interest from the public has, number one, the thing that Purity mentioned, which is good research. So any story that we've done lots and lots of research on and understand all sides, all angles to it, is usually a story that does well, because we then are able to simplify, which is a second part of this explanation, which is you're better able to simplify complex subjects. And by simplify, I do not mean dumb down. I just mean make them more accessible to all audiences, which is something that all journalists should be able to do. And the third thing is, beyond research and simplification, is really finding the person in the story. I think explanatory journalism is all good as a term, but all journalism connects best when people are at the center of it. So any research, any explanations must then be accompanied by the people who are representative of the stories that you want to tell, based on whatever data set or whatever story it is that you're looking to tell. Fourth is the question of impact. Right? And I know this is not specific to the making of explanatory journalism, but it certainly is something that can feed that ecosystem really well. Now, we're thinking about all the time how to be able to improve the impact of the stories that we do, but impact for us means the right people watching the right stories at the right time, ensuring that the story that you explain gets in front of people who need to hear it, who need to listen to it. And that means many times the right kinds of platforms, as well as the right timing, as I had mentioned. And I think that the most important things for explanatory journalism, of course, is context and perspective, right? Any piece of journalism placed within the right kind of context and with the right kind of perspective is able to cut through a lot of the A, jargon, and B, noise that exists within the media environment that then is able to positively feed audiences. So it takes a journalist knowing the story, knowing the person in the story, knowing who will be impacted by the story, but also knowing the perspective that they are going to take when producing this piece of journalism, that then allows for explanatory journalism to be successful. That's a very quick and sort of like dirty explanation, but it covers, at least for the most part, our experience. Yeah.
Okay, so we place a lot of blame on journalists, but from an audience perspective, just throwing the question again back to you, John, is for you as a consumer of news, what can you do to make sure that you're getting the right news for you, and weeding out? I know it's an easy way to just go to the right source of news. That's the best answer that everybody can give. But what can you as a consumer of news do to counter the toxic information that comes to you?
So the buffet that we had at lunch, So think about your news diet much in the same way. Like we don't go and eat, well, Kenyans eat ugali every day, most of them. And maybe that's why we have such a toxic news cycle, because we're feeding on, on the same things. But my point is, get as diverse as possible when you're looking at news. Listen to voices that you perhaps don't necessarily agree with, but also try and look for those sources of journalism that you can see the investment that has been made in Purity's point, research, right? In an investment in really digging out the right kind of information. And you know the right kind of information because it doesn't necessarily align with your biases, right? It oftentimes gives a very objective point of view of what exactly is happening. It can back whatever explanation is being made, not just with random numbers, but with numbers that are backed by other kinds of evidence. And well, it's also good reading or good watching. But for me, the thing that I try and do is to have as diverse as possible a news diet. And by news and media diet, I don't just mean, you know, The Nation, The Standard, you know. I'm talking very broadly, right? So even going into TikTok and finding out what perhaps trending topics are there and what underpins that, that can also, it feeds, I guess, your IQ in a way that sometimes just looking at like hard journalism doesn't. So I'd say that's the thing that I'd do.
Okay, thank you so much. So Mpindi, if we can talk about about media literacy. So what role can media literacy play in helping the public to better understand and navigate the news?
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Hello. Hello. Good. I'm making sure that we stay awake. I just want to jump onto what John just talked about, because for me as a consumer, the first thing is to know my limit, right? As a consumer, know your limit of how much certain news you can consume and say, okay, in a day, maybe this is how much I can consume, right? And maybe also the other important thing that I do is to create a trust list of people and platforms that I know if I go to John's platform or, you know, like Doreen's platform, I will find sort of news I can trust. But I also know that these are people that are not going to, they will know if, you know, news is disastrous or is going to induce stress. They will issue a warning, right? They have a duty to care. And so I create this form of trust list for myself as a consumer. Then in terms of media literacy, the consumer there's need for us as journalists to build the literacy of our consumers, because once people know the kind of content they desire, even they know where to find it. So it will be your platform. So one of the things that we don't do well as media industry is to promote our content or to promote our news and to show that this is what you'll get out of this content. But we do that for other industries. So in terms of literacy, do the audience members know your content very well? Can they speak, you know, extensively about the programming that is on your platform? So if you're a TV station, if you did a random poll with your audience members, would they extensively be able to speak? So literacy has that component that you're able to empower your consumers to know your content, but also empower them with enough, you know, sort of knowledge for them to decipher what is fake and also what is dangerous for them. I come from Media Challenge Initiative in Uganda. We train young journalists, but we also have a media literacy program for kids. So one of the things we do with kids is train them from, you know, like a young age on deciphering news, really, through games. Like we have a game called Media Machine. So they can create their own media stories through acting. And that gives them the power when they see something, either in a movie or anything, they're able to say, okay, this is right, or this is wrong, or this I can't try at home. So that helps.
That's really great. And my next question can go to the three of you as practitioners in the journalism industry. What are the biggest challenges facing journalists and news organizations as they produce content that will counter toxic news? What's the biggest challenge you face when it comes to countering, creating content that counters toxic news?
Can I go first? Okay. So one of the things I realized, the world puts a lot of pressure on journalists by demanding all kinds of things, so constructive journalism, which I really believe in. But today when I was coming, I was thinking, I don't think we can talk about constructive journalism or constructive content without talking about, the welfare or well-being of journalists. So how constructive is it for us to come here and expect journalists to produce quality, constructive journalism when we know they have the littlest salaries in their pockets, right? How do we talk about explanatory journalism when we can't explain how journalists are in prisons and how journalists are being killed? So the first thing that we actually need to talk about, let's talk about constructive journalism and explanatory and the need for it. But let's also talk about the fact that for journalists to get you that content that you need, we need to take care of them. We need to make sure in Uganda we say we need to make sure that you have enough money to construct a house, which is really important. And then we can talk about, the content. Now, the challenges you face, we train young journalists in solutions and constructive journalism. And so when they go to media houses, most of the editors are old guards or they've been there for years, and their eyes are onto the traditional problem-centered reporting. And because it sells, and because, with these sensational kind of stories, you have the eyeballs, right? And it's not to say that if you're doing constructive journalism, you can't do problem-centered reporting or unearth the wrong and evil things in society. We must cover them. But by focusing on problem-centered reporting, we are not telling the whole story. And that's where the biggest challenge is, that we want to be able to show the world that for each and every problem that we experience every day, there are 10,000s of people globally who are working every day to solve, and we are not giving them journalistic attention. And we could do more to provide that attention, to spotlight. So the challenges will always be money, because producing explanatory, deep, constructive journalism requires a lot of resources, and very few newsrooms are willing, or not just willing, but have the capacity to put in place a desk for that. So if they already have an investigative team, one of the tips that I could share is that incorporating constructive journalism within the newsroom. So it could be you have an investigative desk, but you make sure that most of your follow-up stories are also including what other people in this community are doing to deal with this challenge. So it helps to give the viewer or a reader a full scope of the issue rather than just focusing on only the problem.
I think bad news sells. That's why we're very focused.
It does. But good news also sells more.
Yes, it does. And I think I remember a couple of years ago, Nation TV primetime news only did positive stories, and they never focused on politics, which I found very interesting. And I remember feeling really, really refreshed when I was watching news that week. I thought that was such a cool experiment to have. I don't want to take too much time. Purity, why don't you?
No, I wanted to even add more to the point he's saying. Actually, one of the that question, one of the USIU students was having lunch with us. What's one of the challenges? And I remember just telling her psychosocial support. So I just wanted to say that it's important when you get to that point to ask for help and to talk to other practitioners. But for me, the other challenge, in addition to what he said, is access to tools. Because for this constructive and explanatory journalism to be successful, you need an end-to-end understanding of the reality, and so that you don't over-exaggerate realities and numbers. You need access to a wide range of information. So for me, especially for journalists in Africa context, is the lack of access to some of those databases where you can be able to sort of understand sometimes, so for example, if you're trying to understand corruption or something, you need to understand the entire ecosystem, and there isn't enough information readily available for us. The other challenge I would quickly mention, in addition to the tools, these are the tools that will help you to fact check. And that's what sets up aside the good journalism from what is flooding the ecosystem. So to be able to do quick fact checking, there is need for journalists to access various tools and know how to use them. And because I don't know whether the next round you will ask about the challenge, and because I know the two of them will not have this challenge that I'm about to say, is the expertise, and not to downgrade myself or other people. I have been, so as a statistician or a researcher, it will take the whole time. I don't know, the sun will start coming from west if I can tell a story. I was telling Jogosh, I can do all the research, all the analysis of all sorts of situations. But when he asks me for an outline, I'll be like, no, let me explain to you, and you will explain. So that skill set, and the opposite is also true. Sometimes when working with them, and he's great, he's a great journalist, but sometimes I'll be trying to explain some data in an Excel, and he'll be like, no, can you explain more? So sometimes I don't know whether to call it expertise or talent, and knowing how to navigate that space happily. Yeah. So sometimes it takes a lot of screaming at each other before we can come up with a great explanatory piece. Yeah, those are the three.
Okay, that's really interesting. So making quantitative data qualitative, I believe.
And sometimes not necessarily quantitative. Right. I remember during COVID, one of my actuarial friends trying to explain to us the impact of COVID on bank loans. Like, it's not quantitative, but she understands it in a certain way. But her explaining to us is difficult, and when we tell her to write, she's like, how do I do that?
Okay. So now, numbers people and words people have to find a way to coexist. Okay, great. John, I think for you, what has been mentioned so far, what I've gotten is psychosocial support for journalists, access to end-to-end access of information of the ecosystem of what it is that you're trying to investigate, fact-checking tools, and for journalists to learn how to use those tools quickly, and then the skill set to explain data easily. So John, final words on that question, and then I can ask my last question.
Okay. Thank you to Purity for that great expose of our lacking in skills. I will pay you back in kind. But there's, okay, so three things. One is emphasis on what's already been said. And let me just speak about it from the the broader context of what's happening in the media globally as well as locally. So the kind of financial pressure that media is under, and this will come back, it'll come back to explanatory journalism. The kind of financial pressure that the media is under is as a factor of many things, but if you look at it from the point of view of what the actual journalist's impact on how to be able to change that pressure or to reduce it, it is a matter of skills. It's a matter of skill set. That today you can watch or you can read from the New Yorker as easily as you can read from Nation, and the subscriptions are similar in price, means that you're getting two different kinds of quality of journalism. And this is not to take a dig at Nation or at the New Yorker, right? But what it means is that you have in pockets very, very astute audiences who know what it is that they want. And if you're not providing it to them, then they will move on, and that impacts the ecosystem. That goes back to the skill set issue that Purity was talking about. If you do not have the skills as a journalist to be able to explain that then percolates to how the business model survives and how you're able to compete in an environment where you can get media from anywhere, really. The second thing that I wanted to explain as a challenge, ancillary to Mpindi's point, is it's really the money question, right? You see, that we're here talking about explanatory journalism as a model, that's fine. But what usually happens from the funding side of it is that funders, donors, people who support journalism get very caught up in these buzzwords and forget that for the journalism ecosystem to grow, sometimes you just need to fund it. Sometimes you just need to be able to fund the organizations that are doing great journalism and allow for those things, and maybe even seed those things now organically. Let those things happen organically. It's good to have pockets of different subgenres of journalism: investigative, explanatory, constructive. All of those are good, but I think what happens with the funding ecosystem of it is that they get very enamored about different kinds of journalism, and then what then journalists become a single issue journalists, or one-trick ponies, in a sense, to put it more crudely. How that impacts explanatory journalism is that you're always going to come at it in one way, right? So if you know investigative work, then you're looking for an investigative angle to this thing, and you might miss the story, right? If you know data, then you'll be looking at what's the data angle to it. But if you have sort of a more holistic understanding of the field itself, then you're better able to express yourself through different subgenres, and you're open to collaborating with people who have like different skill sets or even different models of storytelling. Njugush is in the audience, Esther is in the audience. You might not think of them as today's journalists, but in many ways they are explaining things in ways that are inaccessible to me, right? But having the ecosystem, having the environment that understands that this is why, or this is how, or this is a secret sauce with which journalism is made, and supporting that, then helps the entire ecosystem grow. The analogy, a rising tide lifts all boats. Then that's what we need to do. We need to be able to support the kinds of journalism that we are interested in, and not force feed journalism or other topics to journalists. That's what harms the ecosystem, and that's what harms explanatory journalism. I know it's a bit of a convoluted train of thought, but I hope I was making sense.
Yes, it has. For me, I'd like to now take a little bit of a tangent. I am a podcast producer. That's what I do every day. I produce podcasts every day, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And the amount of toxicity that can come out of podcasts is mind-blowing. And what people don't realize is these are new age journalists. That is where our younger generation is actually consuming most of their news. And the amount of also misinformation that is there, and it's I can talk about toxicity from as a woman that is thrown at women. There's a lot of medical misinformation that is coming out there, financial misinformation, and it's just thrown at us without any kind of fact checking. And if you try and fact check, you are the bad one in this situation. So now, maybe Mpindi, you can let us know, for podcasters or for people who are new age news makers, what can we do to make sure that they are not part of the toxic news ecosystem?
First and foremost, not everyone should be a podcaster. Eh? So this whole thing of you wake up and then you say, I have an idea.
Mpindi, microphones are accessible, okay?
I
Microphones
understand,
are accessible.
So,
Mobile phones are accessible.
You have...
And I have thoughts and opinions. What do you mean?
I understand, but to be honest, you are very privileged to have Semabox, which is production and distribution platform for. So you are controlling the ecosystem. You attract podcasters. So the question, now let me interview you.
Wow.
The question is then, how do we, which podcasters are you bringing on board? And how do you make sure that the content that is coming out of Semabox, because all of us are going to go to Semabox as an East African platform, right? And then it would be, of course, fact-checking, we can talk about all those things, but I think in the mainstream media, we have the gatekeeper, who is, the editor is able to at least, control certain things. So you also have an opportunity to do that. We are currently running a podcaster in residence program, but one of the biggest challenges is when you look at the pitches you receive and the kind of narratives that are coming through the applications of what kind of podcasts now me, probably someone might say you're dictatorial, but to be honest, there are certain values that I have, that I built like our organization and platform on, and there are voices and narratives that if it's tribal, we will not give it a residence program, right? If we know that, if you are a radio journalist that for all intents and purposes, we've known you for years to be spreading tribal stereotypes on radio, and now you're saying you need another platform, which is a podcast, and you apply for that podcast, I will definitely not let you in. And that's the only way I can control the space as someone who understands, from my perspective, what kind of content we can put our name on. So there will be someone else who can do that, who can provide space for that, and that's fine. But in the space that I can control to say this is what is safe for children, what is safe for young people that are coming through our platform, this is the kind of content we want to put our name on. So,
Okay.
I was going to say, this, what I have seen with like the current audience, they are not that dumb. Like, if you don't fact check your work, they will fact check you. Those who are around Kenya during elections, they saw the like people from class 6 students like saying, no, that's not correct. So I think one of the easiest way to go down is not to take time to make good content in whichever platform. I am a consumer of podcast. I haven't worked on podcast, and really understanding why are people listening to that podcast. No one wants to look for toxicity for themselves. So one of the things I've seen work, particularly with investigative work, I think twice, one by John Allen and another on a surrogacy story. We did the video version and the written version, and then the podcasters picked that and produced it for their kind of audience. So sometimes it's also to use content that has been well researched and it's out there in other platforms. And again, I know as an academician, I can't insist more about research. Yeah.
John?
So the question is, how do we ensure that there's no toxicity or reduce it?
Yes, especially from the new creators.
From new creators. Okay. I think we need to start to talk more about some of the basic skill sets that you require before you pick up a microphone. He's absolutely right. Not everything deserves to be on a podcast, right? Nor does everything deserve to be a story and what have you. The three things that I think are like crucial ingredients are, especially for the new, let's talk about for the new journalist, is data, having an understanding of data. And here I feel Purity's criticism pouring into my soul. No, but I mean, seriously speaking, I mean, it's an important skill set. The second is fact checking, right? So just knowing what the basics are, know what your biases are, know how to, check for different sources, if it aligns with your biases too closely, if it's asking you certain things, if there are no clear answers and there's only opinion being expressed, then those things should become, it should become like a regular staple, a regular diet that people are fed, that this is how to be able to fact check things. And I think the final thing is storytelling. Because there's a fine line, well, it might not be so fine, but there's a fine line between content that can be perceived as toxic and content that can be perceived as controversial. And it's really all in how it lands with the audience, and that's usually a factor of storytelling. How are you telling the story of, to give a recent example online, how are you telling the story of expensive primary schools? Are you going to blame your wife and say that she put pressure on me, right? How wanawake bana, honestly, that responds to some people. Or as I saw as the conversation developed, are you going to try and be a bit more systemic about things? Acknowledge that there is a pressure element, right? But not make it the story. And that's really a skill set of storytelling. And storytelling is a skill that anybody can learn. Because all of us were told stories by our parents, by our people before us, so we know what a good story is. Yeah.
So on to my final question, and June, you let me know if we still have some more time. We have 3 minutes. 3 minutes, okay, literally. So how can news organizations and journalists in general work together to promote constructive and explanatory journalism? And what are some of the successful partnerships?
Oh, me? Okay. So the answer was in the question. It's partnership. Finding good partners, and it's usually based on 3 things. It's based on skills. What skills do you bring to the table? What skills does your partner bring to the table? Interest. You might have the skills, but do you both have a common interest or a shared interest in doing this explanatory work? And so skills, interest, and trust. Okay. So do you trust your partners? Do you trust the people that you're collaborating with? Those 3 things can usually lead you to the kinds of partnerships that are helpful. I'll just plug one example, right? For those of you who voted in the August election, you might have come across a website called Know Your Candidate, right? It was visited over 3-4 million times, and it was a collaboration between 3 organizations, 2 tech organizations, one South African, one Kenyan, and a journalism organization. Those kinds of collaborations helped give factual, even in a sense, explanatory information to the public, but it was based on those 3 things that I had mentioned. I'll stop there.
Okay, and I think one of the examples of those partnerships is the Fumbua initiative. I see some of the members of Fumbua right here, where they were fact-checking misinformation, disinformation, and misinformation, disinformation and malinformation in the media during the election period. I hope they continue because there's still a lot of misinformation right now. So just to finalize with you, Purity and Mpindi, and maybe we can give an opportunity for any questions from the audience.
In addition to collaboration, I would say share data sets, share research, share platforms. Instead of saying something that I think is quite successful, I think, and he knows my thinking about our Kenyan election last year, I think we media, we spent so much money and resources trying to have individual platforms and produce that ourselves. Instead, if we had like a common platform, and then journalists would concentrate more on using this platform to make quality content for those people who cannot interact with the platform. So I would say, for example, some of the data sets, we've shared some of our data sets with other organizations that we trust, will use it well, and they've seen stories that we had not seen. So sometimes pooling resources. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we've spoken a lot about what has happened in the Kenyan context. So Mpindi, maybe you can give us what works in Uganda.
No, generally there are three things I can tip newsrooms to do. One is newsrooms can, first of all, train their journalists on how to incorporate constructive journalism in their stories, be it investigative or normal reporting on how to look out for who is doing something about the issue you're covering in the community. Two, you can create a whole news desk, and there are very many organizations out there that are interested in funding or even building partnerships around constructive newsrooms. And then the other one, which would be very radical, is to just turn around your whole newsroom and focus it on doing constructive storytelling. There's just many examples globally where people have moved to constructive journalism, and it's working because it's very niched and targeted, and it gives people the opportunity to not just know about the news, but to know what they can do in the instance of those stories. So those would be my three tips.
Thank you so much. And at this point, I'd like to take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Any question from the audience? Yes.
Good afternoon, how are you? My name is Olale, I'm a journalist. Mine is more of a comment rather than a question. There are 2 of them. One, with experience of what it means to be a journalist, I think that there's some 2 gaps that are making us suffer as consumers of news. One is media houses identify the best talent, assume like, for example, our brother Namu. Then as he gets better in his work, he's promoted to be the production editor, whatever editor. Then he leaves the good work he was doing, now he's a manager. And they don't bill other people. So we end up like, for example, one of the best news feature I ever saw, I think it was on Citizen. So a journalist left the newsroom, the armchair, and went all the way to Samburu, was like Kipia, and he came up with a very, what do you call it, a bestseller, or what do you call it, a thriller, as far as news is concerned, of some Maasais who are playing cricket. He won an award, he went to BBC and all that. When he came back, he was promoted. And since then, we don't see such things. Creativity, imagination, we need that in the media. Because right now, as a consumer of news, it's boring when you just see politics and no creativity. Number one. Number two, in terms of content, Yeah? We cannot be blaming journalists every day. They do their work. But then now what's the point of, now it's now for the editors to mix it up. It's just like the food we have had out there. So they arranged dessert, this and that. At times you just find, you switch off the news after the what they call it, the news headlines, because it is bad news. Best practices, CNN, Al Jazeera, and whatever, unachanganyisha, we mix. So that now, it's not going to be bad news for the next 15 minutes. So why should I watch for the next 15 minutes and I want to go to sleep? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think Mpindi has an answer for you as we go to the next person. I think 2 more questions and then we can come. Just go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, sir. There's just generally lack of mentorship in the media landscape. And what we've seen, at least in Uganda, is a whole lot of very established journalists. They get poached by international organizations, which is okay, because people look for greener pastures. But what we have, if we have a mentorship gap, it means that there is no one lifting the next generation. We are doing that in Uganda, training young journalists, and we are filling the gap to make sure that, you know, if John Alan starts Africa Uncensored, which we really want, there is a next, you know, generation to stand here and can continue to be mentored by his work. But I agree with you, we need this kind of journalism. And you're a journalist as well, right? Yeah, I mean, you also do it, right?
Thank you. The next question, I think.
Right. Thank you. My name is Simaloi Dajom. I'm a media professional, currently with Internews as the media business advisor of Kenya and Ethiopia. I would like to share specifically about sustainability, because I am learning also from the media development world that sustainability is very different from mainstream media and from the other media that is coming up. It is one thing to fault media for not being able to bring up correct journalism, fact-checking, but the truth is stories are very, very expensive. Especially running a newsroom is extremely expensive. Think about it this way. You have a product that expires every day. No matter how much you produce during the day, by that evening, that product is expired. Tomorrow you start production again, and you have to send out to your people to go and collect. And that's the cycle of a newsroom. So I feel the pinch both sides. And mine is actually an appeal. Wherever you can for the sustainability of media houses and newsrooms, let's support media houses, especially in terms of funding. Because at the end of the day, no matter how objective they try to be, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we've seen an entire wave of media people, very professional media people, losing their jobs, good shows being cut, not because they're not achieving the objective, but because they're just not able to be sustained. So when you invite the mainstream media house, don't just ask for added value or for editorial support, because to get that product that you value so much costs a lot, and it will go a long way in countering misinformation, disinformation, because a well-funded newsroom can be objective. And Alan and the gentleman have raised a very critical issue on how, actually you asked about how to manage podcasts and content that is coming out. I don't know if it's from Gen Z or the people who are consuming podcasts the most. And I would want just to share my take, going back to basics. Not everyone is allowed to go on air. There is, in fact, media ethics is a unit on its own. And most of the successful media houses, you're not allowed to go on air until you go through some level of training. So I would just want to share the same challenge to those that are producing and putting out podcasts, just to put a bare minimum. You know, whether it is a short master course or a short training where you have to go through the do's and don'ts, the things you cannot say on air. The same way you cannot take a lawyer who has not been to law school and allow them to represent you in court, is the same way. I equate the mic with a sword. So before you give someone a mic, ask for their claim, and if they have earned that right. But training would go a long way, because what has been liberalized is the airwave. What is yet to be liberalized is probably the training. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. As we take our last, how many questions? One question? One question, okay. So, the lady behind you, yes. I think Adele Onyango, podcaster number 1, as I call her, she says that for anyone who is in the content creation space, media ethics and law is something very important to learn. So for anyone who is in contact with any content creators, journalists, podcasters, please have them to refresh their media ethics and law. So the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne Gengere. I'm an editorial project manager for Viral Facts Africa, which is a fact-checking initiative that brings together fact-checkers in Africa and public health institutions. So it was launched during the pandemic. My question is about the fact-checking element, because that's what we are mostly doing, addressing health misinformation. And one of the things that we've struggled with is clickbaity headlines, where you see this even from mainstream media, and then when you open the article, it's got, the context has nothing, it's not related to what you're seeing. And sometimes when you ask why people are doing this, they're like, we need the clicks. So, and one of the issues that has come up during this discussion and the discussion we had in the morning is sources of funding. So then how can journalists strike this balance? You know, you want to give out quality information, but as we know, good stories take time to produce, sometimes even months. But also, how do you restore trust? Because I think, based on the State of the Media report we saw yesterday, trust levels in the media have been declining the past 2 years. People are concerned about misinformation in the media. And yeah, one of the key things that people look for is the reporting on important issues. So how do you strike this balance where you want to give out quality, but the funding problem? Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to say, when I say fact-checking, so we are busy fact-checking other content out there, but it's time we also include fact-checking as one of the processes for our own content. So sometimes, for the headline, sometimes the journalist does not have, I say you've just worked on the story, and then you will see it tomorrow with whatever the editor decided. So what I have seen some of the international newsrooms I've worked with is there's the editor, but there's also a fact checker who will say, okay, prove that this statement is true, show me the document. So having a bit of that in your procedures or processes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you, because you are literally, your investigative series are really groundbreaking. What do you do as an organization to make sure that you gain the trust of the audience?
Okay, so because we're a small organization, and actually during the media tour, I'd explained this to some of the people who came. Because we're a small media organization, we don't have your traditional gatekeeping layers. So what we did is that we invited most, if not all of the people within our newsroom to watch the content, especially content that's investigative before it goes out, and allow for them to kind of try and poke a hole in the sky. That's our response to doing so. But Purity makes an important point. Fact-checking needs to be, in and of itself, like a process that everything goes through. My ambition for where we are is, because we have a fact-checking unit within Africa Uncensored, is that as they also produce factual content, they do exactly what it is that Purity is doing, that we can hand them our investigative work before it goes out and they check it. That's the ambition. We are far from that at this point. But you raised, Anne, you raised a question about funding and sources of funding. Maybe this is because I'm now no longer in the mainstream, and I don't have the benefit of a monthly salary. But I think journalists also need to start thinking about the money question, and not in a way that it's the only thing that they consider, but certainly in a way of understanding how it is that their stories contribute to sustainability in a newsroom. That way, when everybody's putting their shoulders to the wheel, they understand what each contribution is. So for instance, if I'm making a TikTok that goes viral, then that adds to the traction that our stories get. Possibly if you have Google AdSense or what have you on your website, that then drives revenue. Or this funding or this training that I'm getting is being funded by a specific organization whose values do not align with mine. In as much as it might contribute to sustainability for the company, what responsibility do I have to say, actually, you know what, no, we can't take this kind of funding. And then finally, it's to be transparent. I think one of the things that increasingly audiences are understanding is that media isn't free, especially good media. But you must be, to as great an extent as possible, as transparent as you can be with your sources of funding. Yeah, to give an example as I finish. So we have funding from different kinds of organizations, Open Society, Forum Save. We've received funding from Ford. And at one time I had to have a fight with a radio journalist because of the reputation that George Soros has, but to explain why it is that we receive that. And in as much as I might not, be impacted by that level of politics or what have you, I have to be alive to the fact that sometimes not all funding sources are equal. And sometimes not all funding sources want you to be equal in your content. And as open and as honest as you are, then you're able to have this open and continuing dialogue with audiences that allows you to find those pots of gold that are there for your content. I think The Continent did it really well a couple of months back by actually asking the audience, there's this bank that wants to fund our work. Should we take this funding? It has to go there. So that might be another way to sustainability.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for any more questions? We don't have any time. Okay, I think we can take one last one, and I think the panelists are still here. I know this is when the questions are coming fast and furious. They're still here. We can just after this session we can sidebar them and have those kind of conversations. Yes, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley. I'm a PR student from USIU. So my question is basically how to remain relevant and steadfast in one's journalistic practice, because toxicity, you talked about it, and I was keen in this forum that many students aren't present, and it's because, for lack of a better word, it's a relevant forum. It's not about toxicity. If it was, there would be more here. And that is why my question is how to remain relevant. Because sometimes when you're producing content, you start very well, and then you realize people aren't listening to you or giving you the time of the day, but they'll give other people, okay, I won't mention, there's someone who's very relevant on TikTok at the moment, because he talks about, unconventional things, and people listen to him more. Unlike if John is producing his series of investigation pieces and people aren't keen for him but keen for the other one. So yeah, that's my question.
I think we all know who that is.
Okay. I'll give a quick answer. Through our experience, when we were starting, we would get 900 views, sometimes at best. I think the thing is to remember that it's like a pendulum, sometimes content. Sometimes it's swinging towards you and you have to make that investment. And when it's swinging away from you, think about what things that you can do to prepare for the next time that cycle comes around. And to make the swings in the pendulum a little shorter, it's listening to your audience. So for instance, this guy who's on TikTok might be doing that because, you know, controversy is strange, it's out there. You kind of want to hear points of view that just make your ears prick up a little bit. But how do we, as journalists, not cross that line, but understand what it is that the audience there is responding to, and figure out how our journalism not so much panders to it, but responds to it in a responsible way, right? So there's this gentleman who was murdered the other day. He's from the LGBTQ community. Set off a firestorm of debate where everybody who had a rainbow colored anything then became a target, right? And there were content creators who seized on that to say, that guy, and that guy, and that guy. There'll always be those guys holding pitchforks and flames in the audience. I think what maybe our job as journalists is to do is to really listen to that conversation and say, here perhaps is a conversation that is about the changing nature of African sexuality, and find those voices who are really talking about what the experience is, and tell that story. I think people would appreciate that a lot more than being told you're lambistic every day, ama you're simping or what have you. You understand? Like it, but that's how I would approach it. Yeah.
All right, I think we can have a final statement.
Yeah, you're still in school, right? Okay. First and foremost, stay in school. Finish school and finish with high grades. But before you get out of school, get skills that will make you different and unique in the industry. Because if you go to Alan to ask for a job or to even start a platform, they will ask more than just the course or the paper. They were looking for the skills. So for me, the most important thing for you to stay relevant as a young journalist is to, get yourself as many skills as you can right now, so that by the time you're out, because now it's still safe. You can still call your parents, they give you money, but after school, it's going to be different. So now, what are those skills? Ask yourself, what are the skills that the industry is looking for? So can you edit videos? Yes or no? Yes? Perfect. Can you edit audio? Yes or no? Yes? Tick. Can you write? Okay, you need to write. So ask yourself, look for editors who are here, and ask them what are they looking for. And then work as much as you can to find a niche that you're passionate about. So be it gender, be it children, environment, and build a body of knowledge. Then, you can begin shaking tables, right? Good.
Oh, sorry, one last thing. Just cultivate an identity that is as close to who you really are as possible, and be true to yourself. I think relevance comes from authenticity. And in as much as we can do all of these things to invest, as long as you're your authentic self and you cultivate that and it's in line with who you really are, I think those are the people that people respond to the most. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, everyone. So can we just have a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you so much for the wealth of knowledge that you have given us. I really do appreciate it. They're still here for the burning questions. We can't ask them now. We can sidebar them, and then we can have the conversation. Alia, please, let's continue the conversation on our social media for the Africa Media Festival. As June had mentioned earlier, please take some time and go and visit the exhibition space that is available, and follow everybody here on their social media. I think they will be available. And thank you so much for joining us during this panel.